Today we're going to go ahead and go through the key takeaways from the feedback mechanisms activity that you did, looking at positive and negative feedback loops. So here's our diagram of both negative feedback and positive feedback loops. Feedback loops always consist of three parts. First off, you have a stimulus of some kind. Okay, the stimulus, it can be something internal inside your body, or it can be something external that you're responding to. Once the stimulus is sent, we have some kind of signal. So this is where our cell signaling that we learned about earlier comes into play. The signal is sent out, and eventually it is received, generally by a receptor at a cell. And then we are going to get a response. The response can be one of many different things. If we looked at those signaling cascades that we discussed before, all of that is built into our feedback loops. So what I want to do first is distinguish between a positive and negative feedback loop. So negative feedback loops are defined by when the stimulus occurs, we get our response, and the response is to decrease the stimulus. The idea here is that you are trying to stabilize the situation and not you want to get back to normal rather than going in a direction that's more extreme. A positive feedback loop is the opposite. Here you have a stimulus, signals sent out, and we have the response, just like with a negative. However, for a positive feedback loop, the stimulus is increased. The effect is amplified, causing it to become more extreme. And that's going to play out in some situations. You want to bring everything back to normal, and in other situations, you want to amplify the effect. So let's go ahead and take a look at some real-world examples. Our first example is thermoregulation in humans. So a reminder, thermoregulation is maintaining internal body temperature. Human beings are warm-blooded, and that means we use our body metabolism to keep our temperature within a certain range, generally between 36 and 38 degrees centigrade. 98.6 degrees, if you think in Fahrenheit, is the standard temperature. Okay, but our bodies actually fluctuate, and outside environmental conditions are constantly influencing us, and we have to make adjustments in order to warm up or cool down to maintain our body temperature within a particular range. Now, this is all part of homeostasis, which we talked about very, very early on in the year. Homeostasis is maintaining an internal environment within a certain range that's conducive to life. So thermoregulation in any animal, but humans in particular, is especially important. So let's look at this diagram here and see what we've got. So we start off, we have a normal body temperature that's occurring. And let's say we start to get cold. Maybe we're outside, cold temperature, forgot a jacket. Our body begins to get cold. Well, our brain is going to detect this. So this is the stimulus. We're going to go in, we're going to detect that low body temperature. And our body is going to respond. Okay, the hypothalamus senses that temperature is too low. It sends signals out into the body, and the cells are going to respond in a couple ways. First off, blood vessels inside the skin contract. By pulling them away from the edge cold surface of the skin, we reduce heat loss. The other thing that is going to happen is the muscles begin to shiver. They're contracting, which generates heat. Okay, both of those things, especially if they're done together, is going to increase the body temperature, bringing us back within the range that we want. So that's what happens if it's too low. If our temperature gets too high, maybe you're involved in a sport, you're starting to sweat, beginning to get a little too warm. Well, once again, your hypothalamus is going to sense temperatures. It determines that it's too high, and it sends signals out to the body saying, we need to cool off. Those signals are going to do a couple things. Some of the signals are going to go to cells, and they're going to dilate the blood vessels. They're going to make them larger, make them closer to the skin. This is why you get red in the face when you're hot. You're flush. Your blood vessels are open, trying to dump heat to the outer environment. The other thing that's going to happen is your sweat glands are going to start producing sweat. Sweat produces water on your skin. That water in turn absorbs a lot of heat and then evaporates, taking a lot of heat with it. It's a very effective way to cool down. Once your body has taken these steps, your body temperature should decrease, returning us back to normal. So here's the question for you. With thermoregulation in humans, do you think we want to use a positive or a negative feedback loop as a way to control temperature? Think back. Negative feedback loops are all about returning to normal. Positive feedback loops are all about amplifying an effect. With thermoregulation, as we get too hot or cold, we want to return to normal, return to that standard body temperature. So thermoregulations in humans would be a great example of a negative feedback loop, because the goal is to return to that original body temperature. Let's take a look at another example. Childbirth and contractions. When a woman prepares to go into childbirth, her body begins to contract. And the process that's occurring is the baby is pressing against the cervix, and that is the signal, okay, the stimulus. Sorry, that is the stimulus. The hypothalamus responds to that, and it sends out signals. And what those signals are going to do, they're going to cause the uterine wall to contract. Well, when the uterine wall contracts, what do you think that does as far as the baby pushing against the cervix? Well, it's going to make it push against the cervix harder. So we have amplified our signal now. The baby's pushing against the cervix harder. Now the hypothalamus is going to release more oxytocin. That's going to cause the uterine walls to contract even more. That's going to increase the effect even more. Stronger contractions. This process is going to repeat over and over and over. So, is this a negative feedback loop or a positive feedback loop? Remember, a negative feedback loop is all about returning to normal. A positive feedback loop is amplifying the effects and making it more and more extreme each time. In this case, this is a positive feedback loop. Okay? So we've got a positive feedback loop here. We are getting stronger and stronger contractions each time because the response, contracting the uterine wall, is putting more pressure against the cervix, which in turn is amplifying the signal. So in this case, what ends the contractions? They don't go on forever. There obviously comes a point where they end. And the answer is the baby is born. Once the baby is born, there's nothing pushing against the cervix anymore, even if the uterine walls continue to contract. And the hypothalamus stops releasing oxytocin, and everything goes back to normal. So here we've got three situations, A, B, and C. And what I want you to do as we go through these situations is try to figure out, are these positive or negative feedback loops at play working here? So let's start with A, right here. So when human tissue, such as skin or a blood vessel, is torn or cut, the cells near the damage send out a signal that activates platelets in the vicinity. As the platelets begin to form a plug, they release more chemical signals to attract more platelets and other clotting factors until the bleeding stops. So, are we amplifying the effect or are we reducing the effect? Well, in this case, the platelets are being added. If the bleeding is still going, we want more platelets, and we want more platelets and more until the bleeding stops. So we want to amplify this effect until we actually clot and stop bleeding. So this is going to be a positive feedback loop, because we're amplifying the effect until the bleeding stops. Now let's take a look at B. When a person is not taken in sufficient water, they become dehydrated. And this affects homeostasis again. This may cause a loss of blood pressure, which will trigger the release of antidiuretic hormone, ADH, from the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. So we are releasing a signal. This hormone signals the kidneys to allow reabsorption of water by the blood vessels to bring the blood pressure back to normal conditions. The big clue here is back to normal conditions. We aren't amplifying the effect, instead we're trying to return it to normal, to stabilize the effect. So this would be a negative feedback loop. The third one, C. When a human increases physical activity, the amount of fuel burned in its cells also increases, which in turn increases the concentration of dissolved CO2 in the blood. What process is burning fuel and producing CO2? Hopefully you said cellular respiration, because that's the answer. The CO2 reacts with the water in the blood to make a weak acid, that's carbonic acid, which lowers the pH of the blood. Sensory cells in the medulla of the brain register this drop in pH and send signals to the diaphragm and heart to increase respiration. That in turn will get rid of the oxygen, sending it out, clearing the bloodstream. So is this a positive or negative feedback loop? Are we trying to amplify the effect, or are we trying to return to normal? Well, our goal here is we want to return the CO2 levels to normal. So this is going to be a negative feedback loop. So we have one positive and two negative feedback loops. Feedback loops play a really important part throughout biology, and you're going to see them in multiple contexts, and so I want you to make sure to understand what they are. We've touched on them several times over the year, but I want to touch on one more time because they will be important as we start talking about the next section of body systems. So this was an introduction to remind you of what we've already covered. Hope it was helpful, and I'll see you all next time we get together for class.